Two letters written by Safran, an abandoned wife, to her husband Khidr in Egypt. The editor thinks sometime in the 12th century. I'm inclined to the 11th. Their letters written in very careful handwriting. Here's the first. Yeah, you can see it. It's got very good pointing in the script, quite unusual for letters of this kind. Safran dictated them, as the second letter makes clear, but evidently to a skilled scribe, or two skilled scribes, in fact. If you look at it, you can read it across this. I've very seldom seen such a human text in 45 years of medieval research. I believed you were a man from a good family, and I believed in human decency. The talk about you means I never knew you. I've come to know you have transported everything secretly to your pretty girl. Aren't you afraid you will come to an evil end? And then, at the end of the page, in the end you worked on me and said, come, move to Cairo. So I came to Cairo since you pestered me. But then you began to go down to inns whenever you felt like it. You seemed like a ghost to me. You arrived with the last evening prayers, you left at dawn, so that people already suspected you weren't really my husband. So, she's cross. There's some formulaic language in these letters, but most of it is actually quite outside the very elaborate Arabic letter writing tradition of this period. And it's in fact, if you look at it quite carefully, it's a deliberate subversion of it, so as to allow Safran to be very personal, very hard-hitting. We can only really sympathise with Safran here. If you read both sides of this, of course, there's always another side to this kind of story, but if she's accurate at all, then her husband Khidr has behaved with a kind of heartlessness, which we always tend to condemn when we see it today. But you must also notice she's not only a victim. She's got the social capital over the page to call in the law, and she eventually has the people with her, who've already, as the end of the second letter shows, meted out some kind of unpleasant punishment to Khidra's fancy woman, even if not with chilling predictability to Khidr himself. Now, on one level, Safran's story shows that nothing is new under the sun. These things, as you know, can happen in any period of human history. But the incidental detail is so dense, it's so bound by time and place, that you could spend an entire lecture just teasing it out, using human ill luck to illuminate a society, as historians generally do. Now, as you may imagine, given the title to this lecture, I'm not going to do that. This pair of letters don't have anything to do with economic history. But on the other hand, they do, and for two reasons. First, the fact they survive at all. Now, why Khidr wanted to keep them, God only knows. But letters like this, from 3,000 years of history, survive in their hundreds of thousands in the dry air of Egypt until collectors took them to Cairo, the US, mostly Europe from the 1880s. They're still being found today. Probably the best known are the letters in ancient Egyptian from the pre-Greek period, and then the letters in Greek, but they survive in Akkadian, Coptic, Arabic, Hebrew, and in smaller numbers in Latin and Persian. It seems at the moment as if the 11th and 12th centuries are the last centuries in which they're really numerous. By now they're almost all on paper. Paper almost entirely replaces papyrus across the period 870 to 950, and it's a cheap medium. That's convenient. And Egyptians of this period make intense use of this convenience. They write about everything they choose, and sometimes, even if not in Safran's case, about very small-scale and temporary issues. Mostly, these issues concerned the administration of tax raising, patron-client relations, but also, often, about the details of buying and selling at long or short distance. And we can gain a genuinely large amount of information from them about daily economic transactions and their difficulties. And people wrote letters, or paid to have them written, all the time to each other about such transactions, as we can tell from the frequent reference in those which survive to other letters which have either arrived or not. So Egyptian social and economic practices are the best documented in Europe and the Mediterranean in the 11th century, as indeed, actually, most previous periods. And that's the best reason for starting from them in a lecture about the Mediterranean as a whole. I'm going to focus first on Egypt, and then at the end I'm going to extend my comments more briefly to two other regions of the Mediterranean, both in Italy, the place I know best. Now, it's certainly not the case that all 11th century texts from Egypt are edited. In fact, only a tiny proportion are. About 1% of the great Vienna collections from which this letter comes. We've got to make do with what we've got. But all the same, for this period, over 1,000 published texts, all except for a small handful of Coptic texts are either in Arabic or in Judeo-Arabic. That is to say, a Hebrew-influenced Arabic written in Hebrew script by Egypt's Jewish community. Almost all the Arabic and Coptic ones, and many of those in Judeo-Arabic, have a translation into a modern language, which is a good thing for me, because I don't have enough familiarity with the languages of the originals. Some of the translations aren't that good, to be frank, but I've taken advice where I need it. Now, the second reason why Safra's letters are relevant for this lecture is the geography they casually assume. Certainly Khidr must be a merchant, because Safra says twice that he's taken, she implies stolen, a set of scales in a box, in other words, for weighing goods out. He's currently accessible in a market hall near Bahnasa in Middle Egypt. The Greeks had called it Oxyrhynchos, about 150 kilometres south of Cairo, a major centre for the wool and linen trade. It may be his family home, because the implication is his mother's still there. But until recently he's been in Cairo, and also its larger commercial sister city of Fustat, often called then, as Cairo is now, Misr, literally Egypt, and is called that in this text. Safra herself doesn't appear to be from Cairo, however. She has to be coaxed to come there, and she has often fled temporarily to the countryside. We don't know which countryside, but those letters from the Vienna corpus that Diem edited had provenances as often as not coming from Ashmunain at the bottom of that map, another 100 kilometres south of Bahnasa, and that's certainly a possibility. So, for two families of, I deduce, medium prosperity, her by implication more than him, that's quite a lot of movement. And Safra envisions, admittedly rhetorically, that Khidr might even go to Sham, the standard Arabic word for Syria and Palestine. And it's for that reason, in fact, that I think it's an 11th century text, not a 12th century, because Sham, after 1099, is in the hands of invading crusaders for a century, which disrupted the long-standing easy movement, news gathering from Egypt up the coast. So, at a minimum, Khidr's circuit is 150 kilometres, and it may have been 4 times that. That's significant, as we'll see. Now, I studied Mediterranean exchange over a decade ago as part of a wider survey of society and economy in the earliest Middle Ages, up to 800. Then after that I moved on to other things. But it was obvious to me then that the great trade cycle of the Roman and immediately post-Roman period was structured by the needs of the state, and that it regionalised quickly as states fragmented geographically between 450 and 700, ending up with very little interregional exchange at all by 800. It appeared equally obvious that the second great trade cycle, which ran roughly 950 to 1000 to 1350 to 1400, perhaps a bit later, which had no Mediterranean-wide state at its back, had quite different roots and offered a different sort of economic problematic, although I didn't actually look at either. I got interested again in the old story of commercial expansion rather more recently. I was working on the history of Pisa around about 1100, because it was part of the background assumptions of so much written on that city in the 11th and 12th centuries. Because the Pisans got rich in that period by intervening by violence in a Mediterranean trade network that was not theirs. sacking Muslim cities in sea raids, preying on ships, a bit like the Vikings in the North Sea in the 9th century or the Portuguese in the Indian Ocean in the 16th. The Pisans of the time thought that was very heroic, and wrote inscriptions on their cathedral, praise poems about the attacks of, among others, Palermo in 1064, Mahdia in Tunisia 1087, Palma de Mallorca in 1114. Modern Pisans, who write most of their city's history, tend to accept that heroism as well, as a necessary part of the city's achievement on the back of it, of becoming a major player in the great trade networks of the 12th century, until the Genoese pushed them aside across the 13th. Now, I'm not going to buy that kind of triumphalism, but above all, I was irritated by the lack of any kind of focused analysis about how that trade network actually worked and changed. And after I looked more deeply, I found that same lack of analysis almost everywhere. Many historians have not got significantly beyond the conceptual framework of Roberto Lopez's work, summarised in his The Commercial Revolution of 1971, for whom, as he put it schematically, demographic growth caused agricultural progress, which caused more surpluses which could be traded, and then the freedom and power of Italian cities, unlike their Muslim counterparts, their flexible commercial contracts were enough to make the European commercial revolution of the Central and Middle Ages happen. And the data Lopez used, apart from the Genoese notarial registers, he didn't know them, hadn't really significantly advanced beyond the syntheses of commercial history of Haidt and Schauber in 1879 and 1906, which they were marvellous for their period. But they were based on extremely restricted data sets, dominated by information about luxury trade. But luxury trade is always structurally marginal to economic systems. If it wasn't, the goods wouldn't be luxuries. And they can't, even if you find the spice-filled argosies of Genoa and Venice really alluring, as romantically minded historians have, you can't use them as proxies for Mediterranean exchange as a whole, as Lopez did, quite explicitly. And the other thing is that when Lopez rounded off his career with that synthesis, it was actually already out of date. Cairo doesn't appear in its index. But already in 1967, Shlomo Goitain had published the first volume of his A Mediterranean Society about the commercial activities of the communities of Cairo Jews, whose Judeo-Arabic letters and documents, above all from the 11th and 12th, were thrown into the Geniza. It's not an archive, it's a huge waste paper bin, hundreds of thousands of bits of paper, of the Ben Ezra synagogue, one of the two main synagogues of Fustat in that period. And Geniza scholarship has been highly active ever since, in the hands of Goitain's pupils and their pupils. In recent years, by far the most significant work on Geniza economic issues has been Jessica Goldberg's Trade and Institutions in the Medieval Mediterranean of 2012. From all this work, a clear picture of a Mediterranean-wide trade by Jewish merchants could be established. It started in the late 10th, and, in other words, well before the Italian cities got anywhere looking into that, was focused on selling Egyptian flax to Muslim-ruled Sicily and Tunisia, Sham to a lesser extent, to be made into linen cloth and sold on, whether inside those two regions, or onto Muslim Spain, or back to Egypt. Looks like that. You can carry on the trade links into Spain. As well as on a luxury trade connecting China and India with the Med, which I won't talk about. To remain dense into the early 12th century was the dominant exchange network on the seas. Now, by now, the network of the Geniza has been added to the Western-centred picture which Lopez inherited. It's now generally recognised that the Pisans and the Genoese and the Venetians simply added themselves to this network by force, and in the 12th century they established trade treaties with the major Muslim powers, as also with Byzantium, which gave them the same sort of rights that local merchants had. So by 1200 the Italians are pretty much in control of the Mediterranean carrying trade, and they shift much of it northwards. as Lopez thought. In fact, so did Haidt in the 1870s. And it stayed that way, particularly after the Black Death hit Egypt, perhaps harder than anywhere, until the Ottoman reunification of three-quarters of the Mediterranean in the 15th and 16th. So you've got a set of intercutting spheres of commercial activity in the whole of Eurasia by the 13th century. It's very clear in Janet Abou-Lugod's book, 1989, Before European Hegemony, that these spheres stretch from Flanders to China, but the one that concerns us, the Mediterranean, was indeed dominated by Genoese and Venetian ships and Egyptian and Italian production. Now, this picture is not in itself dramatically wrong, but it's partial, and it's misleading because it's partial. Because just a thought about basic economics is going to remind you that most exchange is not international shipping. It's local and then it's regional. You've got to grow produce, raise animals, mine metal or stone locally. You then often have to turn them into artisanal products, clothing and tools, locally again. Only then do you have something to be traded, either locally or regionally, which is again the most common thing, or else interregionally. Who produces? Who sells? Who buys? Where does the motor of exchange start? What keeps it going? These are the questions which are going to give form to the infrastructure of exchange. And the maritime network depends entirely on that infrastructure. Without it, the goods won't even get to the coast. And if you start with the maritime network, it's only too common for historians to neglect the local, sometimes almost entirely. It's less sexy, it's more work-a-day. It gets mentioned casually, people move on from it, it's not analysed much, but it's the core. You need to start from there if you want to understand the economic system as a whole. And that means studying the donkey, not the boat. So, here's a donkey. In fact, here are several donkeys. The one on the right is taken from a boat, in fact. Now, it's a cliche of medieval history that transport is far cheaper by boat than on land. Perhaps 20 to 1 in terms of cost. In general, it's true. But goods in every part of the Mediterranean are moved around by donkey first, before they ever reach boats. Even Nile boats, because we've of course got to recognise the importance of the Nile as a major regional route throughout Egyptian history. Arabic letters are full of references to donkeys, and rightly so. We've got to start from there. They did use horses, but they're more expensive. Camels, not so much. They generally used for desert routes. Now, this is why Safra is important, because she's not the Geniza. Here are two maps. On the left, Egypt is documented in the Geniza, and on the right, Egypt is documented in Arabic letters and other texts of the same period. The sides of the circles roughly reflects the number of references to places in published material. The Geniza material is overwhelmingly Cairo, and also northwards up the Nile Delta rivers to the seaports, one major exception just below it, Busir, which I will come on to. That reflects the interest Jewish merchants have in the transmarine trade. Now, the Arabic material is also very frequently connected with merchants, but it mostly comes from fine spots in the Nile Valley. And as you can see, it reflects the Nile Valley focus in its content as well. These merchants went to sea much more rarely, and didn't go often north of Cairo either, even if Safra's husband may have gone to Sham. Now, it doesn't mean that Muslim merchants as a whole aren't interested in the sea. We've got some 10th and 12th century letters that prove the opposite, and the Fatimid rulers of Egypt between 969 and 1171 were very interested in the sea lanes. But these merchants did not get involved in the sea. Theirs was a local and regional circuit, focused frequently enough on Cairo, even if often at second hand, but hardly beyond. These are merchants that use donkeys as much as boats, and who interrelate closely with the peasants whose rents and taxes and house sales also appear in texts like this. and that's why they interest me. I want to divide the sorts of things this Arabic material tells us into 4 separate headings. First of all, it shows that Fustat and Cairo are buying goods from wide areas of Egypt. Well, you'd expect that. These cities are growing fast. As a pair, they may hit 500,000 by the 13th century, more than twice the size of the by then next largest city in the Mediterranean, Milan. These people had to be fed systematically, and we wouldn't need any documentation to allow us to assume substantial specializations in foodstuffs for sale to the capital. It simply has to have been the case. But we certainly find it. Sugar from Ashmonain, honey from Bilbais in the Delta, bananas from Mahala, and so on. And I was particularly interested to find flour sent from the Fayoum, the great oasis just west of the Nile, about 100 kilometres south of Cairo, to the capitals in the early 12th century. Because flour doesn't last as long as grain. You normally mill it just before you make bread. That shows an unexpected specialisation. And this kind of pattern of imports into Fustat, not quite into Cairo. Cairo was only founded in 969. We've got systematic evidence already in the 9th century of a large set of texts of cloth being sent to Fustat from the Fayoum by an extended family of merchants who lived in both the capital and the chief town of the oasis, Madinat al-Fayoum, in the middle there. They bought up linen cloth from weavers across the oasis and sent it on to Cairo, to Fustat, in donkey trains, in this case not using the Nile. Secondly, this stuff shows that there are also Egyptian networks that are less focused on Fustat. South of the capital, we have a number of major towns, Madinat al-Fayoum, Bahnasa, Ashmonain, Akhmin, Kush, Aswan, and others that don't get into our documentation quite so much. They're real centres, they've got their own productions, they've got their own interconnections. Now here, the information is a bit anecdotal, but it still builds up. So, for example, I've got a letter from an entrepreneur in Cairo who's in charge of a gang of wage labourers who cut fodder to supply, not Cairo, but Bahnasa. And he writes to a contact in Madinat al-Fayoum to see if he can get more workers. Or another from Kush describes the arrival in neighbouring Luxor, then quite a small town, of a consignment of timber bound for Akhmim a little further north. And then there's a contract that shows wheat carried back from Akhmim to Kush. And there's cloth, made in many towns on some scale, regularly moved around the country. There could be quite a lot of diversification as goods moved around as well. We've got an account book in Coptic from 1060 to 1063, from somewhere up the Nile Valley, not quite sure where, that shows a Christian entrepreneur buying and selling a striking range of commodities: clothing, a sieve, brimstone, veils, caraway seed, pots, saddlecloth, myrrh, mastic, salt, perfume, nails, sesame oil, real oil, whatever that is, figs, chains, knives, copper, soap. And actually, I would also add here a very interesting letter from a local agent to his landowning employer from the 10th century. It's quite a rude letter in which the agent castigates his master for not understanding when to buy and sell wheat. But in the same letter, equally crossly, he describes how he had to travel to the Dakhla oasis, 300 kilometres west of the Nile in southern Egypt, it's on the slide, to try to look after his employer's madder plantation, where he's caught between the violent claims of the unpaid workers and the absence of any letters of instruction from his boss. Now, a specialised madder plantation, that's for red dye, in such a remote place, must have a substantial outlet somewhere where cloth is made. Fustat is not mentioned in this letter, but Aswan is. And Aswan, it's important to note this, is also the centre for a large-scale ceramics production, which ran along the whole of the Nile into the Fayoum and up to the coastal ports. Excavations regularly show it. That's an old network, going back to the Roman Empire, but it's still a strong one. Egyptian archaeology for this period is not much good, to be honest. Anyway, at least let's just say highly imperfect and chancy. So how many other productions there were with more local distributions is not yet clear, apart from in Fustat itself, which is clearly a major production centre. But the 1990s excavations in Tutun in the Fayoum, ancient Ted Tunis, did show local wares. And a very badly managed 1980s excavation in Bahnasa at least managed to excavate a substantial pottery kiln from the Fatimid period with glazed and unglazed wares, and also Aswan imports. So the existence of these overlapping local networks is important. For the Fatimid state in Egypt is actually very intrusive economically, much more than other 11th century states, even Byzantium. It fixed prices, or it tried to. It often demanded to buy goods at its own prices, as the Geniza merchants complained. But that sort of control was for the capital and the ports. Inland, as far as we can see, commerce is hardly affected by the state at all, but it certainly went on very densely. Now, linked to that is the third point, a remarkable range of trades which are attested in letters and documents for rural and small town Egypt. For example, there's an 11th century list of tax receipts from a set of villages in the southern and southeastern Fayoum that lists the trades of taxpayers. And so it's got an oil presser, 8 shopkeepers, 2 washermen, a potter, gardener, a miller, a tailor, a goldsmith, a brickmaker, a cheese seller, a joiner, a courier. And a cache of 11th century documents from the village of Damouya, at the mouth of the Fayoum, lists 3 separate potters in the village. In the same area, in other texts, Atfih had a silk merchant, Tutun had a tailor, Uklul, 2 turban makers, and also Tutun made its own tiraz, its embroidered cloth, because some of it actually survives with Tutun written on it in Cairo and in the Louvre. Now, presumably that kind of production is the sort of thing that 2 centuries earlier had made up some of the cloth which the 9th century merchants bought up to sell to Fustat. But they must have had local buyers too, inside the same villages, or else the local urban centre of Madinat al-Fayoum, because some of these specialisations are awfully precise. Turban makers. And actually, to me, perhaps the most striking of all, every documented Fayoum village, except the very smallest, has a baker, Farang. I mention that simply because in 11th century Europe, you don't get that specialisation in a village. It's not automatic, even in cities. Baking your own bread's not that hard. But these villages have got enough buying power to allow specialisation even here. So there's enough access to coin to pay for the bread, and that's underlined by our numerous surviving tax receipts. Egypt's taxes are always high, in very exact, often fractional money. Peasants can evidently routinely make enough from selling to get these coins. And wage labourers, even in agriculture, almost always paid in money. And again, in Europe, salaried agricultural labours aren't going to be common until close to 1300, and even then in not very many places. Now, the way that builds up is visible in the documents from Damouya, because they're found quite recently in an excavation in a pot. They're the private archive from the 1020s of a rising Christian peasant called Jirja ibn Bifan. Christians, by the way, are still a majority of the rural population in this period, and of some towns as well. We can see Jirja, George in other words, buying houses and land in and around the village, but also moving up a grade when he takes on the tax farming of neighbouring Atfih in 1023. And he's also a community leader in Damouya because he pays the poll tax for the village in the same year. We've got 2 letters to him from a Muslim merchant, probably based in Madinat al-Fayoum, in which Jirja is asked to buy and sell cloth, rope, rapeseed oil and sponges. In another letter he sells wheat, and in another letter he sells flax to a Jewish merchant. And at least we can see here who's selling the goods. Rich peasants like Jirja, in at least some cases, are key intermediaries. So it's a complex set of local money economies, linked regionally, with the regions further linked to each other, and a powerful, though not essential, linkage to Fustat further away. If this was 17th century England, you'd call the development of this economy Smithian growth. Boats are important. The Nile links most of the main cities together, but between the villages, you can't do without donkeys. Our fourth point here is different in type, but it's no less notable. The existence of specialised factory towns for linen cloth making, above all in the eastern delta, Tunis and Damietta on the top right of that slide, and the villages between them. On that slide, the dotted bits are flax growing areas. We know about these above all from narratives and the Arab geographers, and they're confirmed by the presence of embroidered tiraz cloth from these towns in a wide range of modern museums. Now, Tunis is on an island. Its inhabitants are fed from outside. There's an account of it by a local Tunisi called Ibn Bassam, probably written in the 11th century. I'm sure it's rhetorical, but at least he's local, which claims it has 5,000 weaving looms, 10,000 male and female weavers, not counting dyers, cutters, and so on. The city has a port as well, but it's above all a linen factory town. It seems to start in the late 9th century. I'll go back to the map, judging from the 880s date of the first known tirazes. Some of it's sold to the government. There are government linen factories there for the flash cloth for caliphs and the like, but they also produce on a large scale for the market, both in Egypt and abroad. And the fast developing intensity of this industry is actually perhaps most clearly shown by the rapid victory of paper production over papyrus. Because paper in the Middle Ages, actually until the 19th, is a cloth byproduct. And as I said earlier, from the 1870s onwards, paper replaces papyrus, and it's just when the rise of these textile towns begins. The scale of linen production must have been already great for paper to brush aside papyrus, which has been a millennia-old specialist delta production. Now, it's hardly necessary to say that large one-industry towns are unknown in Europe in the 11th century. But nor could they have been possible in Egypt if the rest of the exchange infrastructure wasn't already present. Their workers have got to be fed from outside, they've got to have a lot of flax available to them, so there have to be specialisations, there has to be a commercial network, so their products, which competed with local linen productions, could be sold. These are the most important elements for the system to work. None of them can be assumed in the 11th century in Europe, or indeed most of Asia, but they're normal in Egypt, as we've seen. Now, all of that's a context for the Geniza and the maritime trade the Geniza tells us so much about. But it makes the pattern of exchange in the Geniza texts less representative than they're often supposed to be. The great Jewish merchants in Fustat bought raw flax from south of Cairo and sent it downriver through the ports of Rosetta. It's in the middle of that slide over towards the left, and most often Alexandria, to be sold to cloth makers in Sicily and Tunisia. They sold other things too, but that's the core of their activities, and it's very well documented indeed. They bought flax from Ashbounain and Bac Nassar and the Fayoum, but above all, far more than all other outlets, they bought it from Bousir, which is just outside the Fayoum, 8 kilometres from the Nile, 70 kilometres south of Fustat, and they regarded flax bought there as being, by and large, of the best quality, commanding the highest prices. Merchants go to Bousir markets very regularly. The rules for sale there are standardised. Flax prices are slightly higher there, but it's, as a result, not necessary to trail around the villages of the Fayoum in order to get it. In fact, there's a famous letter of the 1050s, famous to Geniza specialists anyway, from the major merchant Nachre ibn Nisim to a younger colleague that explicitly says this, quote, "If you spend too much time in the rural areas, you'll wear yourself out. Your staying in Bousir will better your life, lessen your toil," unquote. So there's a network of villages that specialise in flax that sell to the Bousir merchants, who then sell to the Fustat merchants. So there's a commercial system already in place, of the type we've just looked at, which must have funneled a lot of money into this part of the Nile Valley because the scale of flax buying in Busia was very large. Now, there's two things that are strange about this picture, if you've seen against what I've been talking about. First of all, Busia is almost never mentioned in any Arabic letter or document from our period. The network that supplies it must be very similar to those I've been talking about. And the Fayoum is pretty well documented. You can see that Damuya is only 10 kilometres away. It still doesn't appear. Except by implication in Jirja of Damuya's flax sale to a Jewish merchant, who in this case is going outside the flax markets and into the villages. And for that matter, our 9th century evidence showed Fayoum merchants exporting woven cloth, woven linen, not raw flax, directly to Fustat. Now, that's doubtless just a gap in our evidence, but at least shows there are several different competing exchange systems for cloth, even in and around the Fayoum. Now, secondly, the Jewish merchant community is exporting raw flax to be woven 1,500 kilometres away, half the Mediterranean away, when the biggest weaving towns in the whole of the western half of Eurasia, Tunis and Damietta, are just down another branch of the Nile. I mean, it's not that Tunis doesn't appear in the Geniza, it does, as often as any other substantial town, but it appears as a port on the way up the coast of Palestine most often. Now, certainly some of the Jewish merchants trade there, they buy and sell lacquer or foodstuffs, and indeed some flax and cloth, but only as they would in any other town. So they're not ignoring Tunis, but it's not in any sense the focus of their main activities. Why? Well, it may simply be because of the Fustat Jewish merchants are so often of Tunisian origin, so they set up their routes initially to deal with relatives and friends, until the routes remain fixed after that. Tunis, by contrast, largely a Christian town, fewer Jews to act as intermediaries. But the choice seems on the surface to make the Jewish merchant routes we know about less typical of standard Egyptian practices than we sometimes think, as well as showing, once again, how dense, how complicated the choices merchants had about where to focus their activities, because there certainly must have been other groups of merchants in Fustat, maybe of all three religions, which we don't have documents for, who are acting as intermediaries to get flax in large quantities to Tunis and the other weaving towns, because someone's got to. So, Egyptian exchange in the 11th century, and during the Fatimid period as a whole, basic 11th, 12th, is thus very complicated indeed, with overlapping and competing productions and sales. That's certainly enough to sustain and to act as the motor for the Mediterranean-wide exchange of this period. We can already see that with the Geniza, and we would see it again if we did the 13th century with Italian overlapping and competing productions and sales. The only thing missing is the post-1200 hyper-urbanisation of Italy, which means they have to buy grain from somewhere. They buy it from Sicily. That's another commercial network. That's never the case for Egypt, because it's only got one huge city, Fustat, Cairo, and it's got very rich soil for wheat. It doesn't need to buy. But anyway, this exchange is very complicated, but is that enough for Mediterranean economic expansion? And here I would say no. Because the fact is, Egypt had long been like this. Certainly under the late Roman Empire and into the 8th century. It's hard to tell if the Egyptian economy was more complicated in the 6th than the 11th. And it's relatively complicated in the 9th century, given those Fayoumi merchants. And indeed, the major internal development that I mentioned, the rise of the linen factory towns, begins in the late 9th. In fact, you could say, in general, Egypt is the Mediterranean powerhouse in the 11th century, but it's been that way since the Roman conquest, a millennium earlier. And yet, the period 650 to 950 experiences a clear fall-off in the volume of exchange across the Mediterranean as a whole. Now, a decade ago, I argued that in the 8th century, the only areas of the Mediterranean to show any substantial maritime activity were the Tyrrhenian and Aegean seas, with almost no link between them. That's too pessimistic. Recent work has shown a series of interconnections in the 8th and 9th century Ionian Sea, which does indeed link them much more complicatedly as parts of a then very maritime-orientated Byzantine Empire. But even then, the scale of those systems is far less than either before or after. So Egypt's complexity can't on its own be a motor for Mediterranean exchange if it remains complicated in centuries where that exchange is lacking. The simple point here is it takes two regions to make an interregional commercial system. And it takes two regions with a complex internal economy to make a complex interregional system. In 800, or even in 900, there's only one. That's not enough. There has to be a real need for interregional exchange to develop that fully. The only thing Egypt permanently needs from anywhere else it can't provide is timber. It has everything else in one form or another. So other regions will have to produce very attractive goods, or very cheap ones, for maritime exchange to be a sensible thing to engage in. And other regions will have to be prosperous enough to want the goods which Egyptians can buy and sell. So we've got to track the economy of the Mediterranean's other regions to see how they develop, and then see how far the sea links which we can track reflect internal developments elsewhere. Now, it's easily said. Indeed, it was particularly easy a decade ago. In fact, I said it secure when at that time that there wasn't any serious work on it. But now there is. The central medieval archaeology of Muslim Spain, North Africa, Sicily has opened up. There are more and more excavations in Israel, and the material culture of mainland Italy and Byzantium, already much better studied, is much closer to decent synthesis. I stress archaeology here. No other region's got the kind of commercial letters that Egypt has. So in order to tease out parallels to Egypt, we've got to face different problems in each of these regions, and I'm not going to discuss them systematically today in the last quarter of this lecture. I was planning to focus on two regions, Sicily and Tuscany, but I will skip Tuscany because we're going to run out of time. But Sicily is the best studied of the regions that did have early links with Egypt, so it's logical to focus on it. Sicily is particularly striking in the fast development of its archaeology. Barely a decade ago, it was a black hole in the middle of the Mediterranean. Almost no coherent picture of its medieval economy possible before 1350 or so. Now it's getting to be one of the best studied regions of the Med. A lot of really good sites, good field surveys, really classy archaeologists. Its history is less stable than Egypt's. It was conquered twice. First by the Tunisian Arabs from the Byzantines. Here's a map of the different cities the Byzantines, the Arabs took. Hard-fought wars from 827 to the 960s. Later on, a little faster by the Normans, who began in the northeast in 1061, took Palermo in 1071, had completed their conquest by 1091. The second of those coincided with the Geniza letters. They well show how alarmed the Cairo merchants were by the war, as any commercial community would be. But neither war seems to be associated with long-term economic problems. Probably the most significant change is that the old capital of Sicily, Syracuse, in the east, was replaced by Palermo in the west by the Arabs during the wars of conquest, because they didn't take Syracuse until 878. That certainly got economic implications, for Palermo's centrality in the island's economy is very visible by 950. What's increasingly clear is that Sicily's economy is always internally interconnected. Sicily has always been a major grain producer. In the early Middle Ages, both Rome and Constantinople still ate Sicilian grain. The major grain estates are in the centre of the island, so links to the coast must have been maintained. So, for example, Pope Gregory the Great in the 590s knows extraordinarily large amounts about what happens on his estates. When Mediterranean exchange largely broke down in the middle of the early Middle Ages, that exchange network I showed you the circles of has Sicily at its hinge. We can see that above all from the distribution of globular amphorae, of which this is one, all the way across the Byzantine lands. Now, Arab rule didn't produce a complete break in Sicily's pan-Byzantine links. You still get ceramics like this from the east and from the Aegean and from Italy, even to Palermo in the 10th. But as Palermo expanded as the new capital, it becomes much more closely connected to North Africa. From the 9th century, from the late 9th, you start to get polychrome glazed pottery, very characteristic of the Central Middle Ages, initially imitating that of Tunisia, but soon developing a wide array of local types. This stuff's been found in recent Palermo excavations, made in the city. There have been a lot of excavations in Palermo in the last decade, a very complicated set of buildings, ceramic and glass finds for the 10th, 11th, across a wide area. And there's also irrigated agriculture around Palermo and sugar production as well, because the excavators have found pots for water wheels and sugar moulds. And that's actually, we already knew that from one of the Arab geographers, Ibn Hawqal, who was there around 973. That actually helps us believe the rest of what he says, which you otherwise might not, because he hated Sicilians for their total ignorance and stupidity, brought about, he said, by their obsession with eating raw onions. But anyway, he also says that Palermo has a remarkable array of different specialised markets, that Sicily is the only place outside Egypt to grow papyrus. Even Egypt isn't doing it much by then. And that it exports goods. I'll come back to that. But what no geographer would tell us is that after the mid-10th, Palermo made ceramics, glazed fine pottery, oil lamps, amphorae with red paint, regularly found all the way across nearly the whole of Sicily. They dominate the finds from western Sicily. They're extensive for 3/4 of the island. Now, it's very unusual for a single medieval city to dominate in its ceramic production as widely as this. It shows how far the island had been integrated internally, had become integrated internally after 950 or so. In fact, if you move from those across those sites, particularly the ones with a nice picture of a nice piece of pottery on that slide, you'll find a striking uniformity in the material culture of each of them. So Palermo's sending out ceramics. What's it getting in return? Wheat, almost certainly. When we get further into the bioarchaeology, I hope we'll find out more things. But anyway, wheat in return for ceramics, also I think in return for Palermo linen. But anyway, there's a clear internal commercial network in Sicily by about 1000 to make this possible. Interesting signs of complexities in this internal integration. Archaeologists also get excited about another new development after 950, the discovery of Palermo amphorae and glazed pottery outside the island in 24 sites and more, all the way up the western Italian coast and into Provence, and back into Tunisia. Best known examples of these are the glazed bowls, or bacini, which are used as decoration in churches in and around Pisa, but the amphorae, which are the signs of export of wine, or olive oil probably as well, probably doubtless the main feature in economic terms. So you see very clearly that Sicily is returned into an exporting role of a type that it had in the late Roman Empire. And that, again, logically fits with the prominence of the island in the Geniza. In one direction, Cairo merchants are going to Palermo, they're bringing flax and dyestuffs. And the flax shows that another important feature of Sicily's economy must by now have been linen weaving, probably focused in Palermo. But it's significant that increasingly large-scale import, and the Geniza shows that the scale is huge, was for a raw material that's going to be turned into a profitable commodity which is then re-exported and presumably also sold inside the island. So Sicily's economy is complicated enough to underpin such substantial production and consumption. Now, Sicily also exports wheat, wool, leather, wine, the wine presumably in Palermo Amphorae, this we get from Ibn Halkal and the Geniza, olive oil, silk, cheese, timber. There must have been quite a lot of these exports to pay for the scale of the bales of flax going to Sicily and Geniza accounts. Wheat, again, as usual, comes from the grainlands in the centre of the island, then moved down to the coast. Probably it uses the same communication networks as the Palermo Amphorae coming back up. It goes to North Africa, and from the 12th it goes to northern Italy as well. So Sicily is a region that Egypt can usefully have as a trading partner. And the large-scale triangular trade axis, which you can see in the Geniza, that connects Sicily to Tunisia and the Egyptian ports, becomes the core axis for Mediterranean trade in the 11th. Everything else ties into it. The trade with Muslim Spain, with Palestine, northern Italy on a smaller scale, even with Byzantium, the least clearly documented. But now, having looked quickly at Sicily, you can see a bit more clearly what its interlocking motors are. It's not created by merchants on their own. It's created on one side by demand for food and artisanal products, presumably structured by elite and urban demand, as always in the pre-industrial world, but sometimes now even peasants, as the range of artisans in the Fayum villages and the rural availability of Palermo ceramics make clear. On the other side, it's created by productions, by the same artisans and peasants. The coastal towns of each region, often enough in the case of artisans, in the case of peasants in the interior, producing flax in the Nile Valley, grain and wine in Sicily. So in order to do that, there needs to be those internal networks of exchange first before any Mediterranean exchange is possible. And we can see that in Sicily, these did indeed exist to match those of Egypt. Or those in Egypt are denser, but to match them. And Sicily is an island with almost no navigable rivers. Those networks are certainly the donkey, not the boat. Right, as I said, I'm not going to talk about Tuscany, pity, but there you go. But I'll come back to some mainland Italy-related points as I wrap up, because we'll wrap up in the last 5 minutes. So what do these two examples, tell us about the underpinnings of the Mediterranean exchange network before 1100? As I've said, a developed system of internal exchange in more than one region is a prerequisite, so we've got to focus on those independent internal developments, which I've outlined for Egypt and Sicily. I could have outlined for the Levant and Byzantium and Spain and North Africa if I'd done the work yet. Questions unanswered here. I'd like to know more about the basis of internal demand in each region, how local and landed wealth was built up, what it's used for. That's work that needs work. In Egypt needs a critical reworking of some really awful historiography. In Sicily, we have to have more archaeological synthesis, so it will come along. I'd like to know more about the nodes in these internal networks, small towns and market centres. The work for that really does need to be done in the future rather than now. But one question I think we can answer, which is what exactly did put the various economic regions together in the Mediterranean? Because you could easily have complicated, internally integrated regions that didn't link together and develop further complementarities. A particularly notable example in the 11th century is Byzantium, whose economic links to anywhere outside its borders are really pretty weak, even though archaeology is coming to show considerable internal economic structuring, at least in the Aegean. And here the answer is, I think, it may not be a surprising point, though it's in some respects counterintuitive, I think the answer is politics. Obviously the 11th century doesn't have a Roman Empire. Even the Fatimid Caliphate, the strongest power in the Mediterranean, is not that. But the Fatimids had, on the other hand, unified North Africa, Egypt, Sicily, and Sham, the Levant. None of them are marginal to their political project. And it's not that the internal development of Egypt, let alone Egypt, was their work, or even the merchant network which linked them, but the fact that these regions are now part of the same overarching political unit helps greatly. It makes it easier for merchants to get past customs officials in ports without special agreements. In other words, it cuts transaction costs. It helps familiarity with both people. In this period, you can hardly exchange anywhere without knowing locals. But also with regional products, with possibilities. The Ghanese is full of people writing saying, I hear the prices are lower in Tripoli, why don't you go there? In the specific case of many of the more important Jewish families in Cairo, it facilitates their appearance in Cairo in the first place, with their original Tunisian connections still intact. So it's not at all surprising that the three regions whose triangular links structure the Mediterranean network of our period are all Fatimid ruled. And also, Sicily's own inter-regional economic links are always tightly related to its political location in other respects. Before 850, it's most closely linked to Byzantium. After the Fatimid conquest, to Egypt. After the Norman conquest, to the Italian world of Salerno, Naples, Pisa, Genoa. And finally, we've long known this, the increasing importance of the Italian cities in the network after 1100 was the direct result of political violence, made more stable and long-lasting by the most striking act of European violence, the conquest of Syria and Palestine in the 1090s, and a century of Frankish rule after that. But that new and increasing Italian commercial hegemony also shows the limits of politics. Because the one set of regions which was not immediately brought into the Mediterranean maritime network was northern and central Italy itself. Now, I would have discussed this if I'd had time to talk about Tuscany, but it's hardly different in northern Italy, even though Venice is just down an easily navigable network of rivers from the inland Italian cities. Genoa is just over a low pass from Milan. Now, in 1250, all these lands are not only part of the Mediterranean world, but very prominent in it. By 1200, Milan in particular is buying its wool from North Africa, its cotton from Syria to produce cloth, which then, together with metalwork, probably rivals in scale any city in the Med except Cairo. But when the Italians begin to take over the carrying trade in the early 12th, this had barely started. They're moving towards an eventual dominance over circulation, not over the all-important production and demand. Here, Lopez is clearly wrong. Venice is still an entrepot for luxuries, including slaves, not the bulk goods that make any exchange system really significant, with the exception of its own salt. Italian cloth exports from Venice don't start until after 1150, from Genoa from 1180. In the early 12th, the Italian regions haven't yet developed the necessary networks, internal networks, that will allow them to bounce into the possibilities of their new carrying role. And that exchange role doesn't cause their prominence even later. It just makes it possible once the networks are developed for different regions. That's the key point. This late date of 1150 at the earliest for a real Italian productive activity allows us to understand the causation behind economic change more clearly. Or to put most simply, since real economic history is at the local and regional levels, the Italians have to wait a century before they're fully part of non-Italian economic history, even though they're increasingly dominated most of the sea lanes. They rule the boats. Donkeys are not under their control. And it's Egypt that's still hegemonic inside the Mediterranean in terms of production and consumption. In the 12th century, and even later, it's not dominated by anywhere else. And that means that Safra and her dreadful husband can act as a metonym for Mediterranean exchange. It's through networks like the ones they traversed that economic history itself takes place. Thank you.